Good afternoon, my name is Rachel Ayrton. As Paul said, I'm a doctoral student at the University of Southampton and I'm attached to the National Centre of Research Methods there. What I'm really hoping to do in this brief kind of glaze over some trust theory and some considerations about methodological and ethical practice in conflict settings is to provide a framework that we can all use to think critically about what the relationship between conflict and trust might be in the settings where we're doing our research, and how this might have implications for our methodology and for the ethics of our practice in those kinds of settings. What a lot of research on conflict, I think, fails to recognise is that it's fundamentally an interpersonal process. At its root, violent forms of conflict originate from individual behaviour and their interactions with their surroundings and other individuals and groups. And for this reason, I believe Sultan Barakat is right when he describes an interpersonal deficit as being central within post-conflict reconstruction. As he puts it, it's the destruction of relationships, including the loss of trust, dignity, confidence and faith in others, that proves the most far-reaching, potent and destructive outcome of conflict. And within social research, where we as researchers are naturally embedded in the societies and in relationships within those societies where we're doing research, it's very, very important that we're reflective on the role that this interpersonal deficit may have on our research practice and how conflict has affected that. So I'm going to focus on trust as a key quality in interpersonal relationships and as an analytical approach to investigating the repercussions of conflict on interpersonal relationships. What little empirical research there is that focuses on this area tends to subsume trust within social capital. I find trust more analytically useful and meaningful as a standalone concept. And I'd just like to emphasise that this paper is exploratory and it's mainly drawing reflections on some experience of conducting interviews in Juba, South Sudan last summer, which I'll come back to in a minute. So, first of all, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on South Sudan. I'm briefly going to give you a case study of an example of distrust in an interview setting, which has provoked this reflection. I'm then going to have a look at some theory of trust processes, and how conflict may be considered to disrupt those processes. And then I'm going to look at some considerations for trust building in post-conflict settings in order to conduct your research. So first of all, South Sudan, here it is. It's the world's newest country. They gained independence from Sudan as a whole in 2011. And it's a landlocked country with about 8 million people, a mainly rural population, and it's just a little bigger than France. This is a scene from when South Sudan achieved its independence. This was the upshot of half a century of conflict in Sudan. There are multiple conflicts in Sudan, which I won't go into in detail, but as a whole, they are based around the problem of marginalisation of peripheral groups in a very, very large state. And for people in the south, the battle for self-determination actually began before independence from colonial rule in 1955 and continued until the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005. And then finally, in 2011, there was a peaceful referendum where 98% of people voted for independence from Sudan. This is a little scene from just outside my hotel in Juba, which is the capital city. I would show you a wonderfully patriotic picture of a grand civic building in the capital city, but unfortunately there are none in South Sudan, so this will have to do. This new country has a great deal of development challenges. Their Office of Statistics reports that 51% are living below the international poverty line. Adult literacy is estimated at about 27%. And it has one of the world's worst neonatal, maternal and child health records. So it's quite a sobering picture for the new government to consider. So it was in this context that I was in Juba last summer. I was doing a very small research project and I was interested in trust in medical professionals amongst South Sudanese mothers due to their role as guardians of family health. I was using biographical interviews, and within that I was using a participative method where I asked women to create what I would call a timeline using beads as they told their stories about their health experiences, which was then something that they could keep as a snapshot. And this is Rose's timeline in beads here. Rose's interview took place in one of many adult primary schools in South Sudan. Access was enabled via one of the teachers who has a senior role in the school. The interview began well. I began the interview with some general questions about what she thought most people thought about medical professionals and whether most people trusted them. But when we got onto the biographical part of the interview, which involved the use of this timeline and involved asking her more about her personal stories, she expressed suspicion regarding what our intentions were and started asking why we were asking about this. So of course we stopped the interview and responded to her concerns, and then she spontaneously began talking about her life, which we took as her satisfaction really with our explanation. When I refer to us, I'm speaking of myself and my interpreter, who I was working with. The interview was conducted in Sudanese Arabic. So while she did begin to tell her story, from that point onwards she withdrew, and her answers became short and evasive. My interpreter, Keji, afterwards commented that none of that was true from that point on, purely because the health history she presented, nothing had happened, there'd been no problems, and that's a really unrealistic narrative, unfortunately, in South Sudan for large families such as the one she was describing. Her answers were very short, and it was clear that she had shut down in terms of her communication with us. I had a lengthy debrief afterwards with Keji, the interpreter, and her analysis of the situation was that this woman didn't trust me and she didn't trust Keji, the interpreter. The reason she gave for this, and I'll quote her, she said, "She sees you as a white woman and she thinks I'm your puppet," and then she laughed. Rose subsequently returned with her teacher, who was my main contact, and we were able to discuss her concerns with her to reassure her, and with the help of her teacher, the situation was resolved happily. Now this was just one of 13 interviews that I conducted. They were very lengthy, in-depth interviews, and all of the others went extremely well. But this rather surprising event for me caused me to reflect on what went wrong for Rose and to identify trust theory as a way of analysing the effect of vulnerability on research participants in post-conflict settings. So I'm now going to have a very, very brief, I'm going to have to glaze over a lot, so feel free to question me afterwards if you want to. Very brief overview of trust theory so that you can think about how that might be applicable to the conflict or post-conflict settings that you might be doing research in, before looking at what some of the methodological literature and my experience with Rose can tell us about ethical and good practice in such situations in order to build trust. So trust theory is a relatively new area of theory. There still lacks a general theory of trust, so unfortunately I'm also having to juggle a little bit some areas of discontent amongst trust researchers as I go. Trust is generally viewed as necessary to social interaction, and it provides us with a way of dealing with uncertainty and vulnerability in order to move forward in social life. One of the main ways of differentiating between trust theories is between those that emphasise generalised trust, that is, an attitude of trust in most people or trust in strangers, and those that emphasise particularised or personalised trust, where one person trusts a specific other in the context of a relationship and with respect to a particular object or activity or task. There are three main approaches to generalised trust that I'm briefly going to skim over and then reflect on how these might be disrupted by conflict, whichever of these version of events you find most compelling. From my own point of view, I think it is sensible to speak of a generalised form of trust, and I think that forms a disposition with which we enter into personalised encounters. I also don't think that there's enough empirical evidence at present to differentiate between these different accounts of generalised trust, and I'm also not convinced that there aren't multiple factors involved in creating generalised trust, and that different ones may be greater or stronger in terms of their influence in different contexts. So that's why I'm going through all three with you briefly here. So first of all, moral trust. This is the view that trust is very much related to shared underlying norms and values in a society. It's fundamentally a belief in the goodwill of others that states that they will not take advantage of us. It's a general attitude that can be seen as a stable trait of an individual, and it's positioned as the product of the socialisation process. So particularly the parents and key large-scale, perhaps national events in history may influence it, rather than specific experiences. The second version, identity or group-based trusts. These accounts are based on categorisation theory, and they state that trust can be based on either an informal observation of similarities between relevant others, or a more formal recognition of a shared group identity. The clearest example in the empirical research is ethnicity, which I'm sure will resonate with a lot of the context that you may be considering studying. It certainly does in South Sudan. And in these settings, there is a strong in-group bias, which heightens orientations towards mutual outcomes over individual gains, and where sanctions are more likely to be enforced against violations of trust. So that's an identity or group-based version of trust. Thirdly and finally, institution-based trust. Generally, political scientists, as you can imagine, favour this version. And this really focuses on the societal conditions that certain kinds of institutions create. So that is the extent to which others are viewed as equal fellow citizens. Generalised trust, by this account, is more likely to develop in societies where political rights and civil liberties are strong and where inequalities are low. This is according to research by Stoller in particular. It's less likely to develop where institutions are prone to systematic discrimination, inconsistent or arbitrary decisions, and corruption. And I think we can very quickly, based on our knowledge of different conflicts and contexts, consider how these trust processes, whichever those accounts you find more compelling or more applicable to the context where you research, we can see how conflict could disrupt these generalised trust processes that would generate this trust in most people. In the case of moral trust, you can see that it would be very difficult to maintain a fundamental belief in the goodwill of others in the context where there have been atrocities against civilians, where guerrilla tactics have been used, or where there have been local informants within a community. And further conflict has big disruptive impacts on the socialisation process. For example, being able to access education, through displacement, families being separated, and so on. And so the formation process of generalised trust, by that account, would possibly flounder in conflict or post-conflict settings. Second, identity or group-based trust. Within conflict, to speak very generally, there is often a polarisation of group memberships, such that in-group trust may be perversely inflated. Trust between groups may be ruptured, and trust between the groups and those external to the context may be approached with a great deal of suspicion because of doubts over where their loyalties lie. Institution-based trust, I think it's clear in most situations that institutions suffer where there is conflict. They may be weakened, there is likely to be reduced accountability. There's greater scope for abuse and for differential impact on different groups within the community. Further service provision also suffers. So whichever of these accounts of trust you believe is most convincing or most applicable in a context, you can see how conflict would disrupt these processes by which people form generalised trust. So now we're going to look at the more personalised end of the spectrum. Please forgive my childlike drawing skills here, but I find it helpful to visualise it. Rather than going into the ins and outs of the debates about personalised trust, I'm just going to present to you the view of Mullering, who I believe has a very good framework for looking at trust. And he breaks it down into a process where an individual moves from interpretation to favourable expectation. Now, the interpretation is your own rational evaluation of the good reasons that you might have to trust another person, that is, their trustworthiness. The favourable expectation that is the result of this and enables you to take action is your expectation that the other person will act in your interests, that they will act with goodwill towards you, that they won't do you harm, but that they will help you in addressing your vulnerability. And what Mullering observes is that there is no automatic connection between having good reasons to trust and therefore having a favourable expectation. And therefore he posits a process of suspension, which he describes, drawing on George Simmel, as a leap of faith in order to move from this state of interpretation to one of favourable expectation in the trust process. Okay, so fundamentally trust is more than an attitude, it involves action, and a rational calculation is not enough on its own to enable trust to happen. If, as I've suggested, generalised trust forms a disposition with which a person enters into this decision and action process, then at the outset their position may be one of trust, distrust or agnosticism. So that's the entry point to this process of interpretation. And again, this can be disrupted by the process of conflict, particularly if there is a presumption of distrust, if lack of information inhibits their ability to interpret, if their ability to suspend uncertainty through suspension is limited as a result of the traumas they've experienced, or if there are constraints on choice, which means they have to act even in the absence of favourable expectation. Okay, so in the research process, I'm not going to spend time telling you that trust is important in the research process. I'm just going to assume that you believe me about that, in the interest of avoiding being rugby tackled. And I'm going to move on to some considerations for ethical practice in a post-conflict setting, given that trust relationships may be disrupted. Within the research process, we engage with people, we begin knowing them as strangers, and during the course of the process, a relationship is developed. So at the outset, their position in terms of generalised trust is relevant. And what we're really working on through the research process is how personalised trust can be built, whether they begin with a position of trust, distrust or agnosticism about us. So in terms of how the research is perceived, we all have fixed personal characteristics such as our gender, our age, our ethnicity or race, and all of these will be perceived in a certain way and in a particular context. Now there's nothing that you can do about those things, but it's very important to be analytically aware of them and the impact that that might have on the data that's produced, the way that might be perceived. And that was clearly a key issue in my interview with Rose. And it's not just about you as in my case, an interviewer, as a researcher. It's also about others who may be involved. The role of your interpreter, for example. So in some studies where, for example, a young man has been used as an interpreter, that's caused problems because of big age variations. In that society, it would be inappropriate for an older man to divulge things to a younger man, for example. I have a colleague working in post-conflict Sierra Leone, and in her context, she reports that many people have a fear of young men in particular because of their role in militia violence. And so therefore, again, if your interpreter happened to be a young man, that may or may not influence people. Secondly, in the methodological literature, it's very much recommended to look at access as a process of gaining access to a community itself rather than just recruiting participants. Through immersion and through taking the ethnographic approach of being there, you can gain the status of a semi-insider, which can enable you to develop personalised trust in those situations. And credibility comes across as a key theme. Based on research with refugee survivors of war and torture, Benio finds that they use a combination of your professional credentials and personal characteristics in order to make trust interpretations. And they seek congruence between what you say and what they observe, including the actions, appearance and demeanour of the researcher as well as the setting. And finally, very briefly, I've got a couple more PowerPoints, but much less to say about them. The role of gatekeepers is a very important topic in the literature. In my case, I found the teacher who was the gatekeeper to Rose's school to be a supportive resource to Rose. She was an advocate for her as a participant and it was helpful in terms of resolving the process. And from my point of view, in that experience, harm to the participant was reduced by having someone in that gatekeeper role, or more specifically, by the presence of someone to act as a supportive resource. However, it's important to consider critically the role of gatekeepers and the possible power relationship between a gatekeeper and the participant, as this is likely to flow into the relationship between the participant and the researcher. So, for example, if the quality of the relationship is poor, or if the gatekeeper is in an authoritarian role over the participant, this will affect the dynamic of the relationship between yourself and the participant. So it's important to stop. I'll skip to the end. Information and consent processes are important. I'd like to stress being aware of signs of reluctance and avoiding what Bengry, Howell and Griffin helpfully call methodological grooming, in terms of exerting excessive pressure on people who are reluctant to be involved out of a fear regarding participation, and to adopt flexible practices such as conditional consent and bounded participation. Finally, consider how the tools and equipment that you may be using may also not be perceived as neutral by people involved. So to conclude then, what I would really like to encourage for all of us, myself included, is that in the settings where we're conducting research, that we're very reflective on how trust may have been disrupted by conflict in those settings and the implications this is likely to have for our practice, to incorporate that into the planning of our research, into the practice of fieldwork, and also to make it the topic of our analysis. Thank you.